Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm gonna be testing Doom Eternal on the GTX 1650 Super. Thanks to Bethesda and Zenimax for sending a review copy of the game 2 days early. That's why you're seeing this video on Wednesday, so yeah, thanks to them. So first of all, sorry about the music, I didn't want to take any chances, I got burned too many times. So this time around I'll show you two things. The game with a static resolution, so the resolution I chose will be the same across the entire gameplay. And then I'll show you the same thing by using dynamic resolution, since it helps quite a bit if your GPU is struggling to hit certain frame rate targets. I'll talk more about dynamic resolution in a second. In the options menu, my first recommendation, if you have 4 gigs of VRAM as an example, is to put textures on high. If you have 6 gigs of VRAM, use ultra, and if you have more than 6 gigs, use the nightmare option. Then if you have 3 gigs of VRAM, use medium or low. And if you want to lower the settings to improve performance, the individual options that helped me the most were shadows, reflections, directional occlusion, lights, particles, and volumetrics. Lower those together if you want a performance boost. But if you want to make it easier for you, just use the presets. It's much simpler, and very surprisingly the game looks good on low settings, which I wasn't expecting considering how the first one looked. So yeah, it's not a huge loss if you ask me. On the CPU side of things, you only need a quad-core CPU to be able to maintain 60 frames per second, at least for what I tested so far. So if you have something like a Ryzen 3 1200, 2200G, an i3 8100, 9100F, something like that, and your GPU can manage to get 60 frames, then a CPU like that I mentioned should have no problems. If you're aiming for something like 120, 144 FPS, in that case, I'll try to get an i5 9400F, a Ryzen 5 1600, 2600, something like that. But again, if you're aiming for 60 frames per second, a modern quad-core CPU is more than enough. Then on the system RAM side of things, for the 3 or 4 hours of gameplay I did, I saw less than 8 GB. It was around 6 to 7 GB of usage, hovering around those numbers. So make sure to have at least 8 GB of system RAM and on dual channel. That's very necessary on all modern games so far. For the testing, I went into one of the first levels, and I'll show you a place with a good draw distance plus a few enemies on screen, so that will be combat plus a good amount of enemies, effects, all that good stuff. The performance usually suffers when you're looking into the distance, there are many enemies on screen and many effects as well, especially in the earth levels. The other ones didn't seem to be that bad on the GPU, so yeah, keep that in mind. When an effect is very close to the camera, it will drop performance quite a bit. So when you're fighting many enemies at once, maybe you turn some of them on fire, freeze some others, and you get close to them. It can sometimes tank the frame rate for a split second, but after that effect dissipates, it should be fine. That's one of the reasons I recommend dynamic resolution. So now I'm going to talk about that. There's a dynamic resolution option, and you have to activate it into the video options menu. If you select the dynamic option, you can select a frame rate target that goes from 60 to 1000 frames per second. So if we're targeting 60 frames per second, enable the dynamic resolution, select the gauge to be at 60, and then the game will just dynamically lower the resolution, trying to maintain the frame rate that you want. But this is not magic. If your game is at 30 frames per second on 1080p low settings and you put the dynamic resolution to 60, it won't be enough to get to 60 frames per second. The game will just start to stutter because the GPU is still not enough to maintain 60, even at 50% resolution scale. So if the game has to go below 50% resolution scale and you're not hitting anywhere close 60 frames or the target that you set in the gauge, the game will just have more performance issues. So yeah, I recommend you test it out. Maybe try to have around 40-45 FPS when you're selecting a 60 frames per second target. And also make sure to have enough VRAM for that, since once you enable dynamic resolution, there will be more VRAM usage. So yeah, if you run out of VRAM, it can make things run even worse. So yeah, my advice, if you're aiming for 60, make sure to be at 40-45 FPS, then enable dynamic resolution targeting 60, and if that doesn't work, lower the settings, and then if it's not enough, lower the resolution. And when I enable dynamic resolution, you can see how it's lowering the resolution in real time. So when there's a lot going on and the GPU is getting stressed out and cannot hit 60 consistently, you'll see that the resolution scale will be at around 50 to 60%. So you can have an idea on how the game is lowering the resolution in real time by just looking at the metrics at the right of the screen. Very useful. I really like that they implemented that in the game itself. More games should have dynamic resolution by default. But yeah guys, that's about it. If I find a more demanding place in the game, I'll let you know in the description and in the pinned comment. But right now this is how the game runs. I'm using a beta driver that the developers provided from AMD and NVIDIA. So probably the game ready drivers on Friday will be slightly better than this ones. Only time will tell. But yeah, thanks for watching and see you next time.